There were clashes again across the country, but there was a pretty intense one in Kirkland, Washington, of all places, between pro-Israel and quote unquote pro-Palestine protesters, and things got pretty severe. And our friend Jason Rantz was actually on the ground for it, so we invited him to come on the show to talk about what he saw and also to talk about the bigger picture here and how the United States should be postured. Jason, welcome back to Undivided.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you were there on the ground in Kirkland. What did you make, first of all, just the number of people who showed up to a protest on this in Kirkland of all places?
So I can't say that I'm necessarily surprised, as people might know, I'm Jewish. I cover anti-Semitism on my show, and so I'm pretty aware of the anti-Semitism problem that we have in Western Washington. It's masqueraded as being quote unquote pro-Palestinian or pro-Palestine. Palestine doesn't exist, and so when people say pro-Palestine, what they mean is they don't believe Israel has the right to exist on that land. So when I showed up, I guess I wasn't surprised. It was disturbing. I'm always disturbed when I see these kinds of things. And I generally get more disturbed by the way the media covers them. I was looking at some of the coverage, and they're giving equal treatment to both sides, which is absurd. They somehow decided not to play clips of them chanting what they chanted, which is from River to the Sea. They were talking about supporting an intifada. I mean, they were calling essentially for the destruction of Israel. They were pro-Hamas. That's different from being quote unquote pro-Palestinian. I don't know anyone who's like not pro-Palestinian as a human being, right? They're pro-Hamas. They were supporting terrorism the weekend after hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of innocent civilian Israelis were raped, murdered, and or kidnapped. So please spare me that this was like a quote unquote protest. It was a celebration of dead Jews. And any media outlet that tells you otherwise is not giving you the truth.
Yeah, and we talked just a moment ago about the Seattle Times front page. And, when we talk about this, the question I'm going to have for you, but I want to set it up by talking about the Seattle Times picture, is sort of what is the line for you between being quote unquote pro-Palestine and just being an apologist for terrorists? So the picture that the Seattle Times chose is a young boy, right? And he's got some of his family's belongings, and this is the wreckage of an Israeli bomb strike in Gaza. So when I look at that picture, it's like, well, of course I have sympathy for that young boy. He's not a Hamas terrorist to the best of my knowledge. But for you, where is the line between, like I said, being sympathetic for these people who are not members of Hamas and being an apologist for terrorism?
Well, it's the way that it's all framed, right? I think that when you frame a story with that kind of photo, the intent is pretty clear. They could have just as easily shown the dead or injured or suffering Israelis who were the victims of terrorism, but they didn't do that. What they did was show you a quote unquote victim of Israeli aggression. So that's the difference between being sympathetic versus being anti-Israel or anti-war, whatever it is they want to try to spin this into being. I think at the end of the day, you could have shown also some images of the Hamas headquarters or Hamas weapons bins. Like there's so much other things. They chose this on purpose, and they do this often. It's a very sneaky and subtle way to get around being fair towards Israel. Again, I'm not necessarily shocked. I'm just waiting for that Naomi Ishizaki column about the plight of Gazans.
I don't really know a good way to put this question, but when I looked at some of your video from yesterday, and when I've looked at video from other protests across the United States, and I see some of the people who are on the quote unquote pro-Palestine side, I really have a hard time believing that they actually know what they're talking about, or that they just showed up because they needed to be contrarians. Did you get that sense while you were there?
It depends. I mean, maybe for some of the white ones, like the white progressive dude and woman who show up to all of these events, I find it always humorous. In this case, there were two white women who were holding hands. They were a lesbian couple, and they were on the side of the pro-Hamas group. You go to Gaza, you will be thrown from the nearest building. They'll take you to the rooftop and they'll throw you down if you're holding hands with your girlfriend, or if you insist that they refer to you as they or zer. So they're clearly on the wrong side, but it's the quote unquote progressive position to take. They are told that Israel is an oppressor and that the Palestinian people are the oppressed. And so that to them, that's it. There's no nuance in their role on their side of things. You're either oppressor or oppressed. And because Jews are seen as privileged and white and powerful, they're automatically the enemy. Now, for the other folks, they just don't like Jews. We can pretend all we want. I love how people want to pretend, but I don't know how else to put it when after Jews are slaughtered and raped that you celebrate. Seems odd to me.
How much do you think people like Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal have contributed to that sentiment in the United States?
In a big way. She's also an anti-Semite. She partners with anti-Semites who are like overtly anti-Semitic with Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. She defends them all the time. She was one of the few members of Congress to vote against condemning the boycott, divest, sanction movement, which again is an anti-Semitic movement that solely blames Israel for the ills of everything in the Middle East. She was someone who just recently used the language to describe the entirety of Israel as a racist state. This is a common comment from or criticism coming from the anti-Semitic side of things. There's a difference between being critical of Israeli policy, and they'll often tell you that, right? When you call someone out, they'll say, oh, what, you can't criticize Israel's policy or government? Well, when the only policies you criticize are the ones concerning their survival as a nation and the right to defend itself, then you're not going after Israel policy, you're going after Israel. If you want to go after policy, go ahead and cite the policy. They can't do that because that's not what they're concerned with.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, this has been a 70-year conflict that has had, ups and downs. How significantly, though, do you think this attack on Israel sets back any hopes of sort of meaningful negotiations toward peace?
There shouldn't be any. Not with Hamas. There shouldn't be any with Hamas. They're a terrorist organization. You don't seek peace with a terrorist group that wants to see you not survive, that quite literally is built around your destruction. There was never going to be any peace with those folks. Could there be peace in the region with other countries? Sure, so long as it's not Iran, which also wants to destroy Israel. You've seen some inroads being made with Saudi Arabia, maybe a little bit with Egypt to a point, but not with Hamas. You cannot reason with these monsters, and that's precisely what they are, and each and every one of them needs to be wiped from the face of this earth.
Speaking of Hamas, and I'll end here, there have been some concerns that, and we've seen the headlines, right, that members of the terrorist watch list have been captured at the southern border with the U.S. and Mexico. I mean, Lord knows how many haven't. And I've seen some concerns, particularly among conservative circles, that there might already be, Hamas terrorist cells in the U.S. who have come up through the southern border already. How big of a concern, and how is that? How closely are you watching that?
It should be a huge concern, not even just for Hamas, but for anyone who's coming into this country unvetted. You have no clue who these folks are. And you can put your head in the sand, I guess, and pretend we don't have any enemies, that people don't want to do us harm, or that, God forbid, anyone would come into this country illegally with the intent to break the law further. But you're just fooling yourselves if you think that that's the reality. We know, as a matter of fact, that some people who shouldn't be in this country, who are criminals, who are on terror watch lists, are in fact trying to come over. So if we're catching them, think about all the people that we're not catching. Think about the tens of thousands each and every month that are known gotaways. Just imagine that. It takes one time for a terrorist to get through and commit an act of terror to be successful. We have to be successful in stopping them and catching them 100% of the time. That's it. Those are not great odds. And we make the odds even worse when we're essentially inviting them to come into this country illegally.
All right, Jason, and we're going to, just because we're going to bring it up later, President Biden's barbecue he had for staff members while all of this was happening. He's already called a lid for today, which means we're not going to hear from him today at all. Yep. What do you think the posture, the stance should be of the United States right now and the president?
It should be what Kevin McCarthy uttered this morning in his speech, which weirdly enough, because I don't particularly like Kevin McCarthy all that much as a speaker or a leader, he was outstanding this morning. You take a firm stance. You are clearly on the side of Israel. You will work with them to destroy Hamas. You will support Jews. You will do what you can in order to end this, period. And it should be ended on Israeli terms, not on American terms, and certainly not on Hamas terms.
All right, Jason Rantz, host of the Jason Rantz Show on 770 KTTH, author of the book, What's Killing America. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.